Okay friends, to get started on our job, one of the first things we have to do is remove all 5 of our lug nuts and then remove the wheel. With that off, let's go ahead and spray this down with some penetrant. Next, we're going to push in the caliper piston. I'm just going to take my pry bar and carefully come in between the caliper and the bracket itself and gently pry. Go ahead and remove your 2 caliper slider bolts. Remove both of those. Next, we're going to remove the caliper. Once you get the caliper off there, you're probably going to notice that your pads are trying to come out. That's because of these springs. We want to go ahead and remove these from the pads, and then remove the pads from the brackets. Now let's remove our caliper bracket bolts. Leave that in there just a couple threads. Remove your bracket, set it aside. Now we're going to take off our 2 mounting bolts that hold the rotor to the bearing itself. Set that aside so you can reuse it. At this point, be careful because there's nothing holding your rotor on. Put on one of your lug nuts a little bit, and then we're going to hit right along this area here just to cause some vibration and break this free. Be careful not to hit your wheel studs. Remove your rotor. Let's move along to removing the bracket for our brake hose. Next, we're going to remove the axle nut right here. What you might notice if you're working with hand tools is as you try to loosen this is going to try to spin. If you have this closer to the ground, you could take a nice pry bar, come across your lug studs without damaging them, put it down to the ground, and that's going to help prevent this from spinning. With that said, let's remove our axle nut. A little bit of penetrant. Now we're going to use a punch and a hammer, come right in through the center here and break this free. If that doesn't work, commonly people will use an air chisel. Remove your locking cotter pin and then remove the nut. Leave this on a couple threads, give this a couple loving bonks, break it free. Looking at the back side of the knuckle, you're going to find your ABS wire, which leads down to your ABS sensor. I want to remove the mounting bolt for that, and then carefully remove this from the knuckle. Inspect it, make sure it's not damaged in any way, and then set it aside so it's safe. Go ahead and remove this nut, and then we're going to break it free. Keep in mind, this thing could potentially come down, possibly hurt you, and even if you don't have this separated properly, you might put a tug on your axle. Leave that on there a couple threads. Let's give it a couple loving bonks. Let's go ahead and separate this. Moving along to the bottom area here, we're going to remove our 2 lower ball joint nuts. Keep in mind, these are what's holding the knuckle up, aside from your little safety strap up there. With both of those nuts off of there, we're going to continue on by hitting along the knuckle. When we do this, we want to be very careful not to damage either of our ball joint studs. If when you were hitting along the knuckle it didn't want to break it free, what you could potentially do is come right up in the center of these studs. You're going to find that you have an Allen head hole. Just go ahead and take one of those sockets, put it up in there, and essentially we just want to try twisting this and breaking it free. There we are, that's separated. Now we can carefully remove the axle from this as well. Remove our safety strap and get this down and out of the car. Once you have the knuckle removed from the actual vehicle itself, you're going to want to get it over to a press. And what we need to do is go ahead and press this piece out of the bearing. The bearing is going to be located inside of the knuckle. You can see it all right inside here. So what I did was, of course, grab something that fits right over this, and I'm going to go ahead and press that right out of the bearing. Of course, when you do this, make sure you're wearing hand and eye protection and nobody's playing around near the area. All right, there's that. Let's continue on by removing the bearing from this now. With this on the floor, we can have a look at where the snap ring's located. That's exactly where the hub just came out of. We need to go ahead and spray this down with some penetrant, and then of course we're going to get the snap ring out of here. To remove the snap ring, of course, we're going to want to make sure that we break it free. So I'm just going to use a hammer and a chisel, or you can use a punch, and just come along one of these ears, and we're just kind of bonk it around a little bit. Essentially, we just want to break off all these rust flakes so we can get the snap ring off. This whole side right here just broke free. Do the same to the other side. At this point, the snap ring's spinning, so I know it broke free. Let's grab some snap ring pliers and remove it. Get into those ears. I'm going to squeeze this together. Once it starts separating, just go ahead and stick something underneath there, and then be careful because it might shoot off. With that out of there, of course, you're going to want to inspect it. Make sure it's not too rotted and very damaged. If it doesn't feel like it has any more spring retention or it's damaged, you need to replace it. This one looks decent, so we can reuse it. With the snap ring out of there, the next thing that we have to do is start pressing the bearing out of here. When you're pressing out the bearing, we want to be pressing it towards the area that we removed the snap ring from. So we're going to, of course, come from the back and press it out through the front. When I do it, I just happen to have an old bearing right here. It fits right over it, but it's not necessarily snug inside of the knuckle itself. So that way there I can go ahead and drive this out. All right, so once it broke free, you should be able to continue on much easier. All right, so we got the bearing out of there. The next thing that we're going to do is get this off of here, and we're going to clean up the area. The areas that you're going to want to clean on the knuckle is, of course, where the bearing is going to go. We have this area right here where the snap ring is going to be. You want to make sure you get all the debris out of there because the snap ring needs to be able to fit in perfectly. Other than that, when the bearing gets pressed in, it's going to rest up against this back wall right along here. So if you have any large chunks of metal or anything in there, that could potentially damage the bearing or, of course, offset the bearing overall. Once you have the knuckle clean, we're going to bring this back over to the press. We want to make sure we put something underneath it that's going to make sure that it's as level as possible. After that, we'll take our brand new bearing. Now, once you have your knuckle cleaned out, the next thing we're going to do is get back over to the press. We want to make sure that we have the entire situation as we go as level as possible. So the knuckle needs to be level, the bearing needs to be level, and everything else along the way. We'll get the bearing in there, and the next thing you want to do is use your original bearing. And the reason why we want to do that to press this down is because we only want to go along the outer edge here. You definitely don't want to press in along this inner bevel here. Set that on there so it lines up perfectly, and then of course we'll bring this down and press it in. Now when you're pressing this down, you should feel as though it slides right in, easy peasy. If it feels like it's binding, take a quick look at it. You want to make sure that it's not kinked off to the side. All right, I can see that the bearing pretty much disappeared into the knuckle here, but what we want to remember is the bearing actually has to continue pressing in until it bottoms out against the bottom side there. All right, it just got very hard to push in. I'm going to give it a little bit more of a squeeze, and now I'll pause. Now with all the pressure on it still, I'm just going to use my hammer and I'm going to give this a couple loving bonks. I don't want to maneuver it around anyway. All I want to do is cause some vibration to make sure that it's completely settled. Hold your knuckle and relieve pressure. Now back over on the floor, I'm going to go ahead and put in this snap ring. Of course, you want to make sure that it's completely settled the whole way around. Double check it, make sure it's completely seated, and now let's install our hub. To press this in, you're going to want to have something that raises it up off of a level surface. The reason why that is because we don't want to damage these studs right here. After that, go ahead and carefully place your knuckle right over it, and then what we need to do is grab something that's going to fit only over this center race right here. That's exactly where we need to press. We definitely don't want to press on any of the rest of the bearings, such as the black part you can see right there. Now we're going to continue pressing this down. As we press it down, I like to just kind of spin it a little bit along the way. All right, so right there I can feel that it pretty much stopped. I'll just give it a teeny bit more right there, and then of course we'll hold onto the knuckle and release pressure. Remove your adapters, and now we're clear to get back over to the vehicle. Now that we have all this back together, before we go ahead and put it back into the car, I just like to use a little bit of copper never seize. I'm going to go right in the center area here where the axle is going to go through, but also in these two holes right here where the ball joint's going to go in. Let's get this back on the car. I'm just going to carefully start putting the axle in here, and then we'll line up those two ball joints with the holes. You can slide it in. As they go in, of course, you're going to just start the nut right on there. Apply copper never seize along the mating surface of your bearing. Putting the rotor on here, of course you want to make sure that the mounting holes line up. Start in both of your mounting bolts here. And then make sure they're tight. Let's go ahead and put it onto the car. We'll start in both of our caliper bracket bolts, snug them up, and then torque them to 66 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our brake pads. Something to pay attention to is one of your pads for each side is going to have a wear indicator. We want that to be on the inboard pad, so the one on the inside. Also, I want to have it facing towards the bottom on this application. Do the same to the other pad now. Carefully slide this in here. There we are. You'll notice your kit came with brand new springs right here. When you go ahead and put these in, you want to make sure that you hold onto the pads, because what these springs are supposed to do is release the pad from the rotor. Do the same to the lower one here. Make sure you hold your pads, like I said, and let's slide the caliper right over the area. Start in both of your caliper slider bolts. To tighten these up, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto the slider so it can't spin. We'll snug it, and then we'll torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and put the wheel on here. We'll start all the lug nuts on, snug them up, get the wheel on the ground, and then torque the lug nuts to 98 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we finished up our wheel bearing. What's left to do now? Go ahead and make sure you pump up that brake pedal so it's nice and firm, and then take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.